is really horrible, and like it's like just forgetting about Syria completely, and it's I don't understand how that kind of selective memory is possible.
Russia's invasion of Crimea dominates the news. This audacious attack on a neighbouring country has shocked Europe with its sheer brutality. Of course, Muslims have experience of Russia's tactics in war, from Grozny in Chechnya to Eastern Aleppo and beyond. The Russian military machine is neither guided by morality nor humanity. In Aleppo alone, some 30,000 civilians were slaughtered, leaving the few that remained to painfully evacuate their city. Much has been written about the hypocrisy of these past few weeks, the collective sympathy that was largely absent when Middle Easterners were concerned, the overt racial and Islamaphobic undertones that casually accompany news reports, but also the coordinated political response of the past 3 weeks, absent when the Russian bear was on the march in Syria and Chechnya. We have become tired of being valued as second-class humans. Human rights for us is mere mantra employed to invade our countries. But when all is said about the double standards, Muslims are confronted with two big questions. How should we understand the crisis and how should we respond? Sadly, on both counts, many have opted to either embrace the left's anti-imperialism narrative and in turn sound like they sympathize or support Putin's actions. Pro-Russian propaganda outfits like RT and their supporters like Glenn Greenwald are presented as trusted sources, despite their whitewashing of horrific crimes in the massacres of Syria. Some, without political or sufficient Islamic understanding, have even suggested that neutrality is the best course of action. Sadly, there is an absence of political literacy within some of our ummah. This is unsurprising, as today anyone can set themselves up as social media experts, looking to comment on all issues that they have spent a few minutes digesting. A year ago, we were all experts in vaccines and alternative medicine. Today, we are experts in European geopolitics. The Muslim tradition of expertise and informed knowledge has been lost and replaced with ill-informed superficiality. Sadly, this democratization of knowledge has worked to make us intellectually poorer. I am your host, Muhammad Jalal, and today I invite back onto the Thinking Muslim Professor Joseph Kaminski from the International University of Sarajevo. Joseph speaks to me about the crisis, how to view the actions of America and the impact upon Muslims in Bosnia, who are once again facing a belligerent Serbian movement supported by Russia. He also passionately discusses some of the takes that have been circulating the Muslim Twitter sphere.
Right. Well, I think we'll start, and maybe I'm going to start with one of my questions that come way down the line about how Muslims should view the currency, because I think that's quite important. I mean, social media is very much it's a snapshot, and it's not a real indicator of Muslim public opinion. And of course, Muslim public opinion cannot be boiled down to one monolithic view. But I do find that there are sympathies for Russia in the Muslim community. Maybe this comes from the anti-imperialism left, where anyone who's against America automatically earns our respect. But also, I suspect Russia Today and various other propaganda outlets have probably achieved or done a good job in terms of propagating the Russia line and the Russia argument, to the degree that I've come across well-meaning Muslim commentators who are churning out Russia Today articles and analysis. So one line that I found quite prominent here in the UK in the Muslim community is okay, they're both in error. America has its problems, and of course America has undertaken some horrendous acts against the Muslim Ummah in the last 20 years of the war on terror. But also Russia has its problems as well. And so there is an acknowledgement that Russia is indeed the problem. But I suppose the automatic response is that we're sitting this out. We're looking at this from a neutral stand, and the Muslim community just has to not condemn or condone or get involved. And I just wonder, I mean, that doesn't sit easily with me for some reason, but I can appreciate the 20 years of geopolitics that has informed that view. I'm trying to weave this into a coherent question, Dr. Kaminski, but I suppose I want to start by asking, should we as a Muslim community, should we stay neutral in the face of what seems like an unprovoked, horrendous attack against ordinary civilians in the heart of Europe?
Well, in my opinion, withstanding all of the arguments Russia has made about NATO expansionism and this sort of deal that wasn't really an official deal, when the Secretary of State James Baker during the 90s made some comment that NATO wouldn't expand further east into Germany, specifically was talking about. I'm like, anyone who knows anything about international relations knows that a spoken word agreement is not a formal treaty, right? Withstanding all of that, the Russian grievances, yes, this is a clear act of aggression by a great power against its neighbor state. And I don't think that this is the kind of thing that we can just, as Muslims, quietly sit there and say, it's their problem, let them deal with it. Because all of this stuff, the world's an interconnected place. And as things go wrong in Ukraine, there's no reason to think that this won't spread, this irredentism, this Slav, Russian, Serbian nationalism narrative. What's bothering me about a lot of this, other than what I consider to be just childish, too bad, now the white man can fight himself, which is not an Islamic perspective. This is not how Muslims should see the world. And I don't think a lot of I don't think it's as much support for Putin per se as it is sort of like, we got you, kind of like knee-jerk reaction that isn't really intellectualized in a serious manner. And I think that this is a major threat for Muslims, and here's why. It seems like people forget that there are Muslims in the Balkans, right? And I live here, so it's more apparent to me, I think, than most. But if Russia gets away with doing what they're doing in Ukraine and they just march right on through, there's no reason to assume that it's going to stop there, right? Serbia has very close ties to Putin and the Russian government. And there have been multiple documented pro-Putin rallies being held in Belgrade. And if Ukraine goes, that is going to really potentially be destabilizing for Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. Probably more so for Bosnia, however, because there still are troops, big U.S. air base in Kosovo. And my colleagues here in Bosnia seem to think that is, Vucic isn't going to be able to get that. But he could, with help from Russia, potentially destabilize this Republika Srpska part of this country, which constitutes 49% of the landmass of Bosnia-Herzegovina in the north and in the east. And this could be very destabilizing and potentially disastrous for Muslims here. So, anybody who's following geopolitics should understand Russia's dodgy history. And I don't understand how people can just, out of just sheer spite for the United States foreign policy, ignore what Putin has done in Syria. And that entire conflict changed as soon as Putin and Russian troops got involved. It seems like long distant history at this point, but if we remember, there was a point where it looked like the Free Syrian Army and the rebels might actually overtake the government. That the IRGC, the Zainabiyun or Fatimiyun or whichever brigades they brought in weren't going to save Assad. The only thing that saved Assad was Russian air power and Russian troops on the ground. And as for Muslims, this is a disastrous tragedy that I think we cannot just forget because of things America has done in the past. I've been paying a little bit of attention to what's going on in northern Syria, and it's a real disaster right now. Like, people are fighting amongst themselves. Tahrir Sham sounds sort of like a mafia more so than anything Islamic at this point. We all probably know the Bilal Abdul Karim stories, being tortured and forced out. And, it's just caused a disaster. It's not going to get better in Syria. Assad is as strong as he's ever been. Other international actors are starting to come back to him slowly. And this is all Russia's fault. And let's also not forget, Russia's playing a pretty nasty role in some conflicts going on in Africa right now as well, with these mercenaries, this Wagner Group, which we all know take orders, even though they're a private firm, we all know that they're not doing anything that's going to go against the interest of Putin and the Russian state, right? So it's sort of a informal arm of Russian foreign policy as well. So Russia is indeed an expansionist imperial power that perhaps hasn't been as effective as the United States has been at conquering the world, but nonetheless are making their full efforts to engage in great power politics, as we call it. And I don't see any justification for supporting this offensive action that, let's be honest, there could have been more negotiations and other things that happened prior to getting to this point. Ukraine was not about to immediately join NATO in the next month. Ukraine is nowhere even close to being a member of the EU. And this is something that did not have to happen now.
So why do you think Putin acted now?
Perhaps Putin saw that, Biden's a different president. Maybe he thought he could get away with it more. I don't quite know. Maybe he's doing this thinking this will help empower Trump's return, right? Because the price of gas in the United States is well over $4 a gallon, which is that's a big number. Once you cross the $4 threshold, and a lot of people who study politics know that presidential approval ratings really do hinge on gas prices and inflation, both of which Biden has been very unsuccessful in handling so far. So, there's other machinations going on with this invasion, but no, I don't think Muslims can sit on the sideline as a true injustice is transpiring.
I mean, you mentioned Bosnia there, and you brought in the tension or the feeling that exists in Bosnia that the unsteady or uneasy peace that's dominated Bosnian politics for the last since the 90s is about to possibly break apart. I mean, before the Ukraine crisis began, there was a lot of discussion about the Republic of Srpska's stoking a conflict in Bosnia. Has that somewhat calmed as a result of the Ukraine crisis, or is there still this feeling that if we were to call it a possible Russian front through Serbia, that Bosnia could explode once again?
Yes, interestingly enough, once again, speaking with my Bosnian colleagues who are much more personally on the ground, focusing on this as their entire research interest, this tragedy in Ukraine, and it is that tragedy, cities are being destroyed and occupied and countless deaths, actually sadly is possibly good for Bosnia in the sense that the international community now recognizes that we don't want to see this happen again here. And there's, I believe, up to 1,500 was what I heard, U4 troops might be coming back from the EU basically to keep order here in Bosnia, which is something they've been very hesitant to do. And in terms of domestic politics, Croatian actors in this country, because remember, there's three entities here. There's three peoples. There's Croatians, Bosnians, and Bosniaks, I should say, and Serbs. And even the Croats lately have been sensing this disunity, and some of the more nationalist actors here, HDZ party, have been trying to push harder for their own third entity. And the reality is if any of these entities break apart, if there's a creation of a third entity, or if the RS, which is Republika Srpska, the Serbian part, breaks off and declares full autonomy or independence, this country can't really function. It's just not going to work. So these threats to the territorial integrity of Bosnia are very real, and the Croat actors have really changed their tone in the last couple of weeks, talking about the need for Bosnia to remain unified. And even some of the Serb actors have had to realize that, as much as they like Russia and they want to be, their own whatever they're trying for, which isn't even fully clear, that, it's not clear that Serbia even wants to fully integrate this Serbian entity into their country proper. They've also toned it down. Vučić has an election coming up in April, I believe, the president of Serbia. Nobody wants to be on Team Russia right now too explicitly, because Serbia cannot withstand the sanctions and the potential financial fallout if they align too closely with Putin. So they also have had to toe the fine line here. And, a lot of Bosniak commentators see this as finally the opportunity to really move forward on stabilizing this country and hopefully putting an end to all this irredentism and these efforts to break the country apart. But there's only a limited window to act and get things done here. So Bosniak commentators recognize that if this opportunity, and I hate to call it that because it's just it sounds so Machiavellian, but if this opportunity is squandered, there might not be another one to really bring order here. And this country, like I said, I travel around throughout the country. I can freely go into the Serbian part, the Bosniak part, the Croat part, and you don't have troops on the ground stopping cars and no checkpoints or anything. But there's definitely a lot of tension, and a lot of people are concerned, and rightfully so. This country experienced a truly horrific war that sadly has been really sort of missed. A lot of people keep saying this is the worst conflict in Europe and since World War II, but it's almost forgetting that there was a really horrendous 3-year war here where tens of thousands of people were killed, and one of the worst genocides of all, the Srebrenica genocide. So it sort of does show the bias, and we can talk a little bit about that too in media coverage, which does upset a lot of people here and Muslims generally, because let's be honest, Ukraine is getting an enormous amount of coverage, but at the same time, it is also the country that's currently experiencing an invasion from a malignant foreign great power. So,
is it fair to argue that if the Republic Srpska had begun its quest for independence and potentially even used military force in that pursuit, that there would not have been the outcry, the level of unity that exists today in Europe and America? That may not have existed if, for example, if we were to argue this is part of a greater great power game, if Putin had started with Bosnia first.
Yes, I think it's safe. I don't want to definitively say, because we can't really know anything unless we experience it in real time, but I think it's pretty safe to assume that the outcry would have been significantly different, right? Serbia or RS trying to separate from Bosnia as a country would be sort of seen as more of a regional skirmish between, ancient hatreds. This is the argument that some misguided Western scholars have called this. And it would be just sort of chalked up as more of the same in the Balkans, which would be really disastrous. I think eventually if things got really bad here, the EU and the US would get directly involved, because I don't think these guys are completely clueless as to what could happen here. But yeah, I don't think the global outcry and the mass support that Ukraine has seen from just about every walk of life except Russians would have happened here. And part of that is because of, I would fairly say perhaps Islamophobia a little bit, but also partially because, when Russia does something it's a nuclear armed power invading another very large country, right? If there's something going on here, just the scale would be so much less than what we see with Ukraine, right? Like, even if the RS tried to start, a conflict, they wouldn't have the same weapons and the same visual images you could see that you see in Ukraine right now.
Okay. Can we go back to history a little bit in trying to understand the current crisis in Ukraine? Now, for our listeners, can you explain Russia's claims or supposed claims over parts of Ukraine, and why Ukraine means so much to Russia from a geopolitical perspective?
Well, if you look at the writings of a specific Alexander Dugin, who some people write off as a quack or as somebody who's just crazy, but I always tell my colleagues who laugh about him, because he is sort of seen as a fringe figure. His work, his ideas really do resonate with what Putin is doing. So, and he is known to have interacted with people in the highest levels of Russian government over the years. So there's no reason to assume that what he says doesn't sort of resonate with what these people are also thinking. And yes, they see Ukraine as not an authentic state. They see it as a part of this is a part of Russia that should be back the Russians, really, and they're sort of misguided. It's almost a similar irredentism that we saw with the Serbs sort of seeing the Bosniaks as just like they're really Serbs. They just sort of don't understand it yet. And this sort of neo-imperial irredentist attitude is really a part of the Russian far right, and it's been that way for a long time. And this Donbass region does have a large ethnic Russian population, right? But, once again, nation states today aren't designed based on ethnic populations. That's not how things work. And I don't think that'd be a good world to live in anyways. If everyone every state was ethnically pure, that would be ripe for disaster and violence, right? So with Crimea, which also is majority Russian, ethnically Russian, they were able to sort of take that without much without much of a struggle. But this Donbass region is a little different. Crimea itself is something that I don't know the exact history, but I know at one point it was given. I think it was Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine as a sort of a gift, and this kind of gifting of land happened a lot during the Soviet times, right? This is sort of the essence of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Georgian conflict as well. Territories were ceded back and forth as internal agreements to make people happy. And, the problem is when the Soviet Union broke up, a lot of people wanted their claims back, right? And the same with Armenia and Azerbaijan and this Nagorno-Karabakh region. That also goes back to Soviet. So this the idea that this is just about NATO expansionism is what the real misguided understanding is. This is more than NATO expansionism. This really has to do with an imperial belief in reconquesting territory that is rightfully ours. NATO is definitely a part of the equation, but I don't think it's the only thing. And I still think they would look for an excuse anyways to do this, even if the NATO question was taken off the table.
So you bring me to NATO expansion, and Professor John Mersheimer has courted controversy over the last few years, and in particular over this last week when he penned he was interviewed by the New Yorker magazine, and in that he said that Putin is acting according to in effect rational design. He is responding to years of provocation by NATO, and what he specifically meant was that the broadening of NATO beyond its Cold War boundaries was a provocation against Russia and Putin, and he had warned against this for some time. In fact, he cites in that interview that even some of the Cold War warriors after the end of the Cold War, they were worried about NATO expansion, and believe that it was a foolhardy exercise. So he firmly places the responsibility in the hands of America, and the US acted in an aggressive way after the end of the Cold War, where it could have brought Russia into a European alliance. It sought to contain Russia and act in a what he would term an aggressive way towards this great power. And I mean, it seems like you disagree with that, but why specifically? What's the problem with that perspective?
I mean, yes, there is validity to that claim, but at the same time, the world changes, right? And Russia has not exactly been a great neighbor to everyone else. When you look at what it's been doing regionally, really for the last 20-some years, it's not itself the most pacifistic actor. There's a reason why these states all want to join NATO, right? There's a reason why they seek the security blanket of this alliance. And yes, he's right. NATO is primarily about containing Russia. There's no denying it. And but at the same time, I think a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has been operationalized in the last couple of weeks, is really an extreme response to an actor that hasn't even yet really formally begun the NATO accession process. It's unprecedented, really. And he's sort of proving right that, now there's word that Finland is interested in joining NATO, Sweden, all these Balkan countries, or, Bosnia-Herzegovina, once again, is really trying to speed things up here. Nobody's really seeing Putin other than Serbia as their ally and friend who they can trust and depend upon. So, while he may have a technical point there, in reality, though, you have to look at his actions as well. And they haven't exactly been the most, let's say, neighborly, so to speak. Like I said, I should be clear here. This action didn't just happen overnight. There have been planning, some security reports have indicated that basically since Biden took power, there have been evidence that Russia's been getting ready to do this. So this has been going on for almost a year, the preparations for this, right? And they started to speed up in the last couple of months, but people on the ground sort of felt something might be coming. So, Mearsheimer's argument, I think, is missing the point. And this is what happens when you're a hardcore neo-realist, is that we do have international institutions, whether we like them or not, and you're supposed to go through those institutions when you try to rectify a problem before just starting an aggressive offensive war to get your way. And it doesn't really look like Putin calculated all that well exactly what's going to happen, because it seems like the world community is almost universally united against his action. And
what did Putin see in global politics that allowed him to miscalculate in such a great way? I mean, Putin is normally regarded as a cool, rational actor, a strategist. So what went wrong for him?
Well, I think he thought perhaps that Trump had weakened things enough that, if you look at, perhaps his assumptions might not have been all that crazy at the time. Hungary was completely going against consensus for the last, Poland as well in many ways. We can see that.
And these two countries have come on, have joined the alliance, right?
Yes, absolutely, yes. And I don't think he could afford to. He probably assumed if he did something like this, there would be some economic sanctions, but the mass exodus of corporations, McDonald's is closing down, Adidas won't sell their clothes there anymore, Apple, all these companies, he probably didn't see this level of unity on this. And perhaps also he thought he had some leverage with this Nord Stream 2 pipeline for the Germans. He probably thought they're never going to do anything because this is like huge investment where like they're totally dependent upon us for oil or natural gas specifically. So therefore, like, he probably thought a fractured, frayed Europe left in the aftermath of the Trump years would continue, and he would just sort of be able to get away with this, and there would not be enough unity to really stop it. But within a matter of days, there's almost global consensus that this is wrong, and this is because there's no reason to assume that if he gets away with doing this, Belarus is already a puppet state. He's already conquered that without even having to fire a bullet, and there's no reason to assume that why not go for those Baltic countries next, Estonia. Perhaps even Latvia and Lithuania. Why not seize them next? And that would be a real problem because then NATO would be obliged to actually get involved in a gun-to-gun conflict with Russia, right? So I think that, once again, going back to self-interest, there's an element of moral outrage, but also the reality is if Putin gets away with doing this to a non-NATO country and he decides let's see if I can get away with pulling off Estonia. Well, the way that Article 5 works is that everybody be obliged to fight back. So, trying to stop him now before it really turns into a genuine world war is absolutely in the best interest of European actors who, have no stomach to have that conflict with a nuclear-powered country like Russia.
I mean, in a way, I'm perplexed, Dr. Kaminski, as to why he acted now and why he acted in the way he did. He was fighting this murky war in the Donbass region, where he could actively deny that Russian forces were involved. He has been chipping away at the so-called European democracies across Europe, and Hungary is a good example of that. There was a strong alliance forming, or at least a relationship forming between Hungary and Russia, and he's been meddling with elections all across the Baltic states and in Central Europe. He had established very good relations with Italy, and of course that was based on a very transactional relationship. It was energy dependence, but nevertheless, nevertheless, these countries were very reluctant. I mean, I remember last year when Turkey began to export its drone technology to Ukraine. France and Germany were dead against it. So even the Western European countries who are now squarely with the United States at that time were very hesitant to arm Ukraine and to build a sort of a military force against Russia in case it provokes Russia. And I suppose France has been for some time talking about moving beyond Crimea and working with the Russians because we need a partner against so-called Islamic terrorism, and I think he really means the Sahel region. So things were moving in Putin's direction. I suppose is the long way to get to that. It didn't seem like there was a need to act so decisively now. I mean, Could you put that down to, there's been a lot of discussion about Putin as an irrational actor. Could you put that down to, the mindset of Putin, or is it just unfair or unwise to go there?
I mean, I think it's difficult to really fully speculate on the mental health of any major world leader without having good evidence to back what you're saying. It's going to be interesting to see the effect of these sanctions, and if they even matter. Like, if he really is at a point where I'm going to go out with a bang, so to speak, then this could really be dangerous. And the thing about Russia's regime is it's very personalistic. I tell students that Russia's regime is far closer to something more like a Syria or a North Korea in terms of like what happens next if Putin goes than say Iran or China, where there still is a real infrastructure to replace the supreme leader when he dies. Or if something happened to Xi, the Communist Party would obviously cook something up real quick and order to be restored. When Putin goes, it's going to be a real scramble for power, just like as if something happened to Assad. If Assad goes, that's it, right? Same thing with North Korea. There's going to be some major, major changes if something happened unforeseen there. And I think that this is what all that makes it more risky. And this is probably another reason why people in Russia who have the capacity to potentially challenge his power may be hesitant, because it could be even worse, right? The devil you know is better than the devil you don't know, right? And the timing is really interesting, coming right out of COVID, Olympics just ending. Maybe he thought this would be he could just pull this off and nobody would really stop him. And clearly he was wrong. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with these negotiations, if any agreement is made between Zelensky and Putin to end this, because most people have commented if there isn't a decision made soon to reach some kind of enduring agreement, the violence against civilian targets is probably going to escalate. And this is going to really turn into a real, unmitigated total war against Ukraine.
The Aleppo, the so-called Aleppo strategy.
Yes, just bombing everything and not caring who gets killed, which is a tragedy of epic proportions for everybody, all of humanity. That's not just, we can't just boil that. Remember, and another thing, from the Muslim perspective again, we have a situation now where we have Chechen Muslims, many of whom don't really support Putin, but they have to be quiet. Some who really do support with this current Kadyrov regime, and they're fighting Muslims in Ukraine, right? So we have Muslim-on-Muslim violence here that is definitely not going to help unify an already fractured global ummah, if you want to see it from that perspective. And it's really definitely going to fracture Caucasus Muslims as well, right? Because, let's be honest, most Caucasus Muslims aren't really huge Putin fans. We all remember what happened there. And this is something that also is very detrimental for, I think, the global ummah, is having two different people that are of the same religion fighting each other on different national borders. And this is very bad, right? So this is another thing we can keep in mind. This is a divisive tragedy for Muslims living in that region as well. And, what a disaster to be some kid living in Dagestan or in one of the other places and being called up by Putin to go fight in Ukraine. And this is unbelievable if you think about it. This is horrible. So, we should lose focus on that as well. There are Muslims involved in this. There are Muslims being killed in this, and there are Muslims killing each other in this.
And I want to, you touched on China there, and you indicated that Putin had miscalculated the response of China. I mean, China's response has been somewhat surprising. It, of course, hasn't fully come out in condemnation of Russia's activities, and it will never do that. But at the same time, it has not condoned its invasion of Ukraine. And very noticeably at the General Assembly vote last week, China abstained from the final vote, and I think that was an indicator that China is somewhat unhappy with Putin's strategy thus far. I mean, again, why is that? Why has China been very reserved in supporting? Probably, I mean, Russia's strongest ally or partner in the world is China. I mean, the Chinese have at the same time suggested that Russia is one of our strongest partners, but their actions do not back up their speech here. So what is going on here with China, and why has China opted to take this very very soft stance on the crisis?
Because I think China still wants to be a part of the world. Like, by siding with Russia, you're basically putting yourself on the team of being sanctioned and boycotted and having corporations leave. And China doesn't want to go that route. And I think this is an important global response to let China know that if you do something similar with Taiwan, there could be a similar response to you. I think China is definitely playing it very strategically sound by not, China, being that it's China, can get away with sort of not, by abstaining. That was a statement in and of itself, right? They didn't need to vote affirmatively with everyone else. Just by abstaining, that was enough of a statement. And I think that, these sanctions are pretty serious. Being kicked off the SWIFT system is no joke. And basically having your airplanes not being allowed to fly over anybody's airspace means you can't go anywhere. And, people are like, I see a lot of people mocking, ooh, Nike's leaving, or ooh, McDonald's, oh no. Well, this is actually a big deal. These are jobs. These are corporations that pay big taxes, right? There's money going, there's a huge loss from these corporations leaving this country. And I thought it was also very telling that I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, Iran also didn't. There's only 5 countries, like I think Syria, Eritrea, countries that really have very little influence and power, countries that themselves are pariahs. Even Iran didn't want to get because they also have an interest in getting this nuclear deal revived. And by siding with Russia, that's going to make it very hard for them to re-enter the global community. And we saw some interesting pushback when I think it was Lavrov basically sort of potentially floated the idea out there that if, this doesn't end, this could affect the nuclear deal. And Iran very forcefully said, no, this isn't how it works. We're going to operationalize our interests and stop it. And, Iran has really been dependent upon Russia as one of its allies. And that also, I think, is very telling. And I think it goes to show that nobody really actually is Russia's real friend. And this, of course, is how power politics works. But, we see that when the going gets tough, nobody's willing to jump on board with Russia. It's very transactional. And it's a relationship with China and Iran and all these other countries have with Russia that's really based on their own interests. And in the current climate, it's not even in Iran's interest to go against the global consensus too hard, right? And that's a big miscalculation on Putin's part, and a big miscalculation that is going to really put pressure on him, because if the Putin regime is going to come down, realistically, it's going to come down from within. Nobody's going to invade and liberate Moscow. Nobody's going to take Putin out from, no CIA spy is going to come in there and, give him ricin or something. It's going to happen from an internal coup of the oligarchs or the people rising up to the streets, and demanding change and him being forced out that way. So this is the most realistic non-nuclear option, right? Because every other option involves invasion or other direct kinetic action, does open the door to really serious repercussions.
And do you think the Western sanctions regime is aimed towards that purpose?
Yes, that's absolutely what it's aimed towards. I think it's absolutely aimed towards getting him destabilized and either put in check or taken out altogether by internal actors. And this is sort of what the sanctions regimes against Iran has been about as well, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody really wants to go in there and try to remove the government. So the best way to do it is to get the people to do it for you. And, it'll be interesting to see how much loyalty people have to this regime. Russia's a very poor country, and it really is a paper tiger economically, right? It is not an advanced economic country in the same way that some of these other, it's not an EU country. It's not even China. It's a country that really is dependent upon a very limited amount of natural resources that it sort of exports. And, when you turn off that oil, like with the oil sanctions now going into place, and if that catches wind in the EU, Russia's economy is in really big trouble. Their currency is worth 155 rubles to $1 US. I mean, you can't live like that. And I think that the squeeze of these sanctions is going to start to be felt more and more each passing day. And it's going to really, Putin's going to have to make a move one way or the other, right? He's going to either have to end this war, or he's going to have to really escalate, right? But the status quo ain't going to work, in my opinion, as these sanctions further take hold.
And can I ask you about world energy prices? You mentioned there that after yesterday's announcement, we're talking just after Biden announced that he's going to stop purchasing oil from Russia, and there is now a movement across Europe. Of course, it's very difficult for Europe to untangle its reliance on Russian energy, gas, and oil. But it's moving in that direction. Boris Johnson announced simultaneously yesterday that 2022 will be the year where Britain ceases to purchase energy from Russia. And Britain is not as reliant as, say, Germany is on Russian energy. But the movement is in that direction. But in the short term, we're going to see phenomenal energy prices across the world, and that's going to create its own challenges for domestic politics across the West, but also, for the developing world, that's going to probably suffer, especially countries like Turkey, who are net importers of energy from Russia and from elsewhere. How do you see the next year or two faring in terms of energy prices and the impact of this?
Well, I think it's going to, obviously, as you said, the prices are going to be very high. I mean, my gas bill just went up this month even. So, things are happening here already. But this is another reason why there's probably, once again, another country that probably benefits from this is Iran, right? Just more desire to get things done. And this time people are going to need to buy Iranian oil. And even Venezuela, it's been clear that Biden has been even seeing if they can get involved in that. For the United States, it shouldn't in the long term be as big of a deal because a very small percentage of U.S. imports are from Russia for oil. But yes, it sets a trend. When the United States does this, others were more likely to follow. And, that means if the EU starts seriously cutting back or banning Russian oil and natural gas, then that is a death sentence for their economy. Their economy already may be in a death sentence, but that will be the end. And people are gonna. Like I said, this conflict is bad globally. This is why, as Muslims, we have to pay attention because it's going to affect all of us. Every one of us needs to use transportation one way or another. And this includes. So even if you don't own a car, the price on the train, on the bus is going to go up because these things require this. So this is another argument, and I know I'm going to sound like a environmentalist here, but for getting away from the dependence on natural gas and oil, we have technology to harness solar and other safer and less, other energy sources that are less polluting. And maybe it's time to start taking that seriously. And this is one way to keep check on some of these rentier oil states and these other states that are autocratic, is to not give them the money that they get from these rents that they sell, these oil sales, right? So if countries diversify their economy or their energy sectors and their energy use, then this would by default weaken the position of someone like Putin. So, it's the year 2022 and, electric cars are becoming more and more common. The technology is there, but people still don't want to fully make the serious move away from, oil and natural gas. And I think it's something to be taken more serious now.
Where do you see, or how do you assess the future of the liberal world order? I ask this because until this crisis, most commentators were assessing American power to be declining. They were assessing, after Afghanistan and the failed withdrawal, Biden was seen to be a failed, leader when it comes to foreign policy, and he had lost moral authority in the world. But a lot of this has turned around, right? America is back, and the rhetoric is backed up by meaningful action here. We see a unified Western alliance, and that's going to be hard to break, at least for revisionist states or for even states in our part of the world that do want to, establish their own sovereignty over their affairs. So I assess this as, a return to American power and a return to this liberal world order. Am I exaggerating this analysis? What's your take on this?
Is this a long-term reestablishment of the liberal global international order? I don't know. I would guess probably not. I still think that there's right-wing actors that are going to continue to seek their autonomy from the globalists, et cetera, et cetera. But I think for the time being, in the time of crisis, it does show that America still is the leading superpower of the world. And nobody's looking to China to solve this. Everyone's looking towards Russia and NATO still, or the United States and NATO. And I think that sort of shows that, America still reigns supreme, whether we like it or not. And it seems like that this is a chance for the United States to sort of, as you said, reassert itself if it handles this properly. But at the same time, this is a very high-risk game, especially with a nuclear-powered state. Engaging in a direct conflict with Russia would be catastrophic. And this is why politicians all across the aisle would avoid starting a war with Russia. So, yeah, I think that this is something to think about. And what is the lesson for Muslims is that we still need to develop our own voice. We still need to create our own ability to not have to run to America every time something goes wrong, or to run to some other power. There needs to be a unified Islamic consensus. And, the current leading actors in the Muslim world are not getting the job done, right? Saudi Arabia, Egypt, these are not places that are going to protect us. And I think that it shows we have a long way to go. And this should be a wake-up call for us as well. That we're going to have to look out for ourselves, and we're going to have to start getting over petty differences and trying to unite in the face of continued global adversity.
Dr. Joseph Kaminski, Jazakallah khair, thank you very much for your time today, and it's been great speaking to you.
Great, I really appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity, and like I said, I think it was good. I think it was a good discussion, and I think hopefully people will enjoy this. And I think I really think personally, I've been so appalled by the comments I'm reading online. This like ha ha ha, you're getting first off, United States and Ukraine are not the same, right? If these are not by Ukraine getting bombed and these people being killed, that's not showing America anything, right? You're not getting back at America. It's just innocent people. I've been to Ukraine. It's poor. It's very poor. It's incredibly poor. I stayed one night in a hostel for €6. And I said, wow, this is cheap. And she goes, really? People often say this is too expensive. So this is a country that really, if you put it in the EU, would by far be amongst the poorest countries per capita. People really are poor there. And, it's a place that still has a lot of corruption. Yeah, there are some neo-Nazis there. That Azov brigade is real. Their symbolism is nasty. But at the same time, the Ukrainian forces aren't all Nazis. There are elements of that. But at the same time, it's not the same as what Russia's doing, which is truly aggressive.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I just think there is a lack of political literacy in the Ummah.
Yeah, it's people forget that Russia's actually bad too. What the United States did in Afghanistan is horrible. There's absolutely no forgiving that. But what Russia's doing in Syria is also horrible. It's really horrible. And it's just forgetting about Syria completely. And it's I don't understand how that kind of selective memory is possible. It really is exactly political illiteracy and a lack of understanding of how serious a Russian victory, a quick victory, would pose a threat to Muslims in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Albania, and even Muslims living in Serbia. Because remember, there's the Sanjak region, Novi Pazar. These are Muslim majority areas, and all these people would be under real threat and pressure if these fascists got their way to create their ethno-religious Russian whatever empire that they want.